So people who are here in the room and people who are out there in Zoom land, I'm so glad that you could join us for this talk. This is our first talk for that the center is having for 2025. And this is a wonderful start because we're going to hear about some really interesting research today. I'd like to thank Dr. Malike Yumaz and Nadine for organizing and looking after the Zoom and the technology because I couldn't do it. So this is actually great. And I'd also like to thank the Office of the Vice President Research for supporting this hybrid speaker series at the center through the Research Center and Institute's Engagement Fund. So just a few words about the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice before we get going. So the center takes a broad approach to human rights and restorative justice. It approaches human rights not simply as legalistic entitlements, but also as ethical claims founded on cross-cultural notions of human dignity and well-being. And so this approach to restorative justice emphasizes responsibility, redress, peace building, and societal repair. And the work of the center is founded on the belief that collective acknowledgement of past atrocities, redress of present abuses, reflection and repair through restorative justice processes can help build more equitable and inclusive societies. Before I introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Antonio Paez, I'd like to just briefly provide the land acknowledgement. And so we want to acknowledge and recognize the Indigenous inhabitants of the land that we're guests on and that we work on, and on which we study and in which we live. So acknowledging the original inhabitants of this land and the history they share with this land is an important step in the process towards reconciliation. We acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us, and we recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. McMaster University Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice recognizes and acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It's also directly adjacent to the Haldeman Treaty territory. And the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement uses the symbolism of the dish to represent the territory and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. And with this land acknowledgement, we acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us, and we recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Now, I'd just like to briefly introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Antonio Paez. So Dr. Paez is a professor in the Faculty of Science, and he's at McMaster University. He's the winner of the 2024 Edward L. Ullman Award for the Association of American Geographers for his contribution to the field of transportation geography. His influential work on the role of transportation in promoting a more equitable and just societies explores important issues related to social inclusion and equity and justice, and offers perspectives on how mobility and accessibility facilitate social inclusion. His work has addressed the role of public policy in alleviating transportation poverty and the impacts of mobility limitations on disadvantaged populations, including low-income families, single parents, and people with disabilities. Here at McMaster, Dr. Paez's work has informed policy to increase the cost sensitivity of drivers to parking services with the objective of nudging them towards transit and active travel. And as someone who doesn't drive and is very proud of the fact that she doesn't drive and relies on public transit and her bike, that delights me. Dr. Paez is currently part of the leadership team of the SSHRC-funded project Mobilizing Justice, and he's going to talk about some of this research today. And I'm so delighted that he's agreed to talk about his research and share some of his insights with us. So welcome.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So can we switch the screen to the presentation? And so there is a musical. So if you want to click on that one and get the music going, set the volume to whatever is comfortable. Yes, so this work on equity and justice in transportation is sort of, hopefully not the culmination, but it's been part of a process of growth that has taken years on my side, working on issues related to older adults, social inclusion, families that are single parent, low income families, and so on. And that sort of, coalesce in this big Mobilizing Justice project, which is a multi-institution cross-sectoral project that is looking at different ways of improving the equity and the justice of transportation systems in Canada. So the title of presentation, not just transportation, just transportation. And I apologize for beginning with a quote by noted deep thinker from the 70s. But I think that this exemplifies a little bit, kind of what transportation scholars face when trying to discuss issues of equity and justice, right? It's like, but a road is a thing. How can that be unfair? How can that be unjust? It's just an inanimate object, right? In that sense, Mr. DeSantis is not wrong. The road is just a road. But actually, there is so much more around it that he either refuses to see or knows, and he is just being disingenuous about it, right? So let me begin with just a quick definition of transportation, right? So for those of you in the audience who are already steeped into the discipline or not, but transportation is something like sandals. We have been doing transportation for a long time. Probably the first transportation technology is covering our feet so that we can walk at higher speeds. These sandals found in a bat cave in Spain are over 6,000 years old. They're quite rare because footwear, usually the case is made of materials that are not preserved. But there are examples like this showing that we have been doing transportation for a long time. So from ancient sandals to modern highways, transportation is a class of technologies that essentially aim to compress space and time, right? So the objective of transportation is to allow us to exchange space for less time than would be the alternative, right? So we can move faster, we can get to more distant places with the same time budget. So that's what transportation does. Transportation allows us to basically achieve that space-time convergence, which is a really good thing, right? So we can, reach more destinations, we can discover more of the world, we can, find more resources with the same or less effort. So when we think about this conception of transportation as a class of technologies that achieve that, it's like, well, in principle, isn't that a really good thing? How can that be unjust? How can it be unjust indeed? How can a shoe be unjust? I don't know if anyone recognizes this, right? The Chinese shoe for women who had their feet bound. How can a shoe be unjust? It's not just the shoe, it's a practice around the shoe, right? How can a highway be unjust? It's just an inanimate thing, it's just an object. Well, how can it be unjust? How indeed, right? And we see here and a scene of the construction of the interstate highway in the United States, basically blazing through a downtown region, potentially displacing countless people as that is built. So that idea that, it is an object, it's just a technology, is it's something that I think we have become accustomed to think about technology as if it was something neutral. But the reality is that technology is always political. Technologies always do something for someone and do something to someone. And those effects happen at some point in time and at some point in space, right? So thinking about technologies as not just the objects that do something, right, but rather that do something to someone and something for someone allows us to see that they will be contested objects of politics, right, that potentially will, do beneficial things for some people, but negative things to other people. Who gets what? It's going to be political. So story time. Once upon a time, there was a good roads movement in the good old USA. Okay. Who is familiar with the good roads movement? Okay, so a few of you. So the good roads movement, which was active from the 1870s to about 1930. It's really interesting because it started with Northeastern, so that would be like New England, people who cycled. So it was something that started with people in bicycles. But eventually, as it grew, it became a coalition of a number of different sectors, right? So depending on who you're reading, it will say that is motorists, progressives, scientists. Other sources will say people from cities, farmers, and business people, right? So essentially, it was a fairly broad coalition that advocated for essentially good roads, right? And in this particular reading, it was this coalition calling for governments to produce expertly planned and maintained roads, right? Which gives an idea of experts getting involved into that there will be, an element of, technique, expertise, knowledge. Is not just anyone, making roads. Is the government and doing that in the best possible way, if we think that, scientifically doing roads is the best possible way of doing that. So the good roads movement started in the 1870s and was extremely active until the 30s. It gained a lot of attention. So here we see two advocates of that movement. On the left-hand side is Frank Hitchcock, who was the owner of the Tucson Daily Citizen, so owner of a regional newspaper, business person, right? And on the right, it's Coleman DuPont, who at the time of the picture was a member of the Republican National Committee, and then went on to become senator. So these were kind of the higher profile proponents of the good roads, advocating for that. But despite being atypical in the sense of how much power they held as business people and important politicians, they were fairly typical in a different way. As we can hopefully appreciate from this photograph, which is Wood Road Boosters inspecting Sand Oil Road, 1914. And we can see that all of them are, shall we say, melanin challenged. So it's mostly, white people advocating for the interests of other white people, right? So far, so good. I mean, if they're advocating for good roads and the good roads are a public good, who will complain? But the good roads movement had a hitch, and it was that building road was really, really expensive. So you can imagine at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, roads would mostly be dirt. When it rained, there would be a mess, and so on and so forth. So why not? Part of the good roads movement was that it saw trains as being somewhat elite. It would have been like the jet set of their time. And so they thought that roads would be a more democratic way for people to move around, right? But doing that was really expensive. So what is a former slave state to do faced with the expenses? I didn't know that Juanita was teaching a course on the history of slavery this term. But if you thought slaves, well, not quite. Slavery was already abolished in the United States, but what is the next best thing?
Indentured labor.
Right? So these are the people building those expensive roads. And convict labor was widely used in that process of road construction in the United States. This is something that was explained in a few different ways. According to those reformers who wanted good roads, bad men make good roads, but also it's good for them, right? It's making good roads is good for them. It's going to build character. These bad men make good roads was actually a popular saying in Georgia at the time, right? But it was not just like popular lore. So here we have W.D. Washington, who was the New York Commissioner of Highways, so a public official, basically saying the exact same thing. I believe that vast good can be done, not only for the men themselves, but also for the state, by the use of the services of the inmates. So they will get this, the benefits of this wholesome, healthy outdoor work, right? So that was sort of, the way this was spun at the time. It's anyone's guess if they believe that, or they were just saying it. But the reality is that a wholesome workout, this was not, right? So there are the accounts of working in chain gangs at the time, and there is one in particular that kind of survives, which is remarkable because it was not a black inmate. It was a white inmate that ended up in a chain gang, and then he wrote a book about his experiences while being chained to other men and doing all this really heavy work, right? Well, those accounts, as you can imagine, are horrifying. So the conditions in which these people lived and worked and slept and ate were just appalling, right? So on the one hand, we have these reformers, and as we saw, they were mostly, if not exclusively, white people. They also spun the story that, this expensive, hey, we can do this for their own benefit. It's for your own good, right? And then use convict labor to do a lot of that work. that actually happened in a lot of states, right? So in Florida, in Georgia, in Colorado, with variations in Colorado, they pioneered something that they call the honor system for convict labor. And that was something like, we trust you not to run away. So they could work with light supervision, right? And so it was like, oh, how progressive. The reality was that, this was fairly widespread, and it was on the backs and the sweat and the blood and the tears of many of those mostly Black convicts that the Dixie Road was built, and then eventually what became the first national highway in the United States, connecting Florida all the way to Michigan, right? So that was, or this is sort of the origin story of that huge piece of infrastructure, highways, just objects. And eventually, that became part of the US interstate system, which is really interesting because Ingram calls this process the high price of modernity, right? So roads were seen as modern, auto travel was modern. It came at a high price, but who paid it, right? So that's what Ingram asks: who paid that price? And yet, the people who were asked to pay the price were not done yet paying after things like the Dixie Highway and then after that the interstate. Because at that point, this is what we say. White men's roads through Black men's homes, right? That the interstate highway system as a policy tool, it actually accomplished, it was designed to do a few things, provide the network, create the network, but also to as a tool for urban renewal, which basically was a tool of displacement. It was a way for this huge federal machine and program to say Black neighborhoods, they need to be renewed. They're dirty, they're poor, they're this, they're that. Let's just build a highway. And that will accomplish, in addition to transportation, the renewal of cities. And this is a policy that casts a really long shadow, right? We see these homes were seized illegally. It's another crime to keep them vacant, right? So the inefficient use of infrastructure, besides having, displaced, by some estimates, close to 500,000 of households and more than 1 million people who were displaced as, the interstate highways were built. We get to the question of what did highways do to Black and poor people? We see that first, they were forced to work. They were used as forced labor, right? So the technology did that to mostly Black people. And then the technology was used again as a tool for displacement, which basically destroyed communities, that interrupted the opportunity for wealth creation, right? So we are barely a few decades after the abolishment of slavery and so on and so forth. There is an emerging Black middle class, and now their homes are gone. So if home ownership is an instrument of wealth creation, that was taken away from them. The shadows are so long that we still see those huge projects continue to limit access to opportunities, and that is employment, that is education, for example, and continue to impose a heavy burden in terms of the psychological well-being of people as well as their physical health, right? So highways were really bad. They did, some really bad things to Black people, but they must have done something good for some people, right? What was their point? And so highways gave many people the freedom of the road, which was part of the good roads story. It's like more of us will be able to, reach more destinations and so on. So that is something that the interstate system accomplished. So gave many people the freedom of the road. It also allowed some people to create wealth, right? So this is happening also at the time when the GI Bill that supported veterans coming back from the war, right, to become homeowners, right? So now we have like the suburbs are a land of opportunity, made possible by all the roads that were built in the previous decade, right? So now we have, that enabling the suburb that is also combined with support from the federal government as part of the GI Bill for now a white middle class to begin to emerge as well, or to strengthen that middle class at least. Amanda is actually reading about the racist implementation of the GI Bill and how many Black veterans were denied benefits, right? So again, another way in which that was done in a way that was prejudicial to some people. And on top of that, for some people, those big transportation projects were actually an opportunity to extend the shelf life of existing structures of power, right? It's also well documented how those interstate highways basically put Black people on one side and white people on the other side, as a way of separating that. And that the labor and the displacement all ended up basically reinforcing a system that was, probably was on its last legs. Okay, well, this just goes to make sure that that stands. So politically, what this story illustrates is that highways did some things to some people, and they did other things for some other people, right? And that didn't happen at Brandon. So if we saw that and it was like, the distribution of the burdens and the benefits of those things fall more or less proportionally among different population groups, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's the cost of, having a highway. But that didn't happen at Brandon. And it's only recently, in the past few years, that research has started to show how it was, in a way, actually a very deliberate strategy. That was essentially a very race-based project. So that uneven distribution of the burdens and the benefits of transportation is something that has been very stubborn to tackle, right? So we have that long shadow of the policy. And so when it's in her introduction of the center talks about, the past harms, the present injustices, and so on and so forth. And so we have all that legacy of injustice compounded by all the other injustices that happen today, right? So something that has been very, very persistent. And that continues to benefit some people, right? So Jeff Bezos coming down to Earth from his 15 minutes joyride to space, saying, I want to thank every Amazon worker, employee, and every Amazon customer because you guys paid for all this being the rocket and the trip to space. The founder of a company that continues to benefit from the broad network for the delivery of the things that, big logistics empire, obviously, he is still a beneficiary of all that, right? And meanwhile, the Amazon workers, which I find just appalling, they are subject to such unreasonable work schedules and delivery schedules that they essentially don't have back breaks. They have to tie a bottle to their leg because they cannot stop, right? So we see how that system that we carry from over 100 years ago, it still is making some winners and some losers, and that surprisingly, the winners are still melanin challenged, and the losers are still brown and black. Now, this is not something that will be new to transportation scholars. I think that transportation scholars mostly are aware, with the possible exception of economists, and not all of them. But that transportation scholars, many of them are, come from backgrounds in planning or geography, so they're sensitized to social issues and so on and so forth. Some will come from engineering, and their interaction with geographers and planners and so on sensitizes them. So I don't think that the reality of those injustices will be that they won't be oblivious to it. And yet, I think that as a profession or as a field, we are not really well prepared to tackle issues of justice and equity. I hope that at some point someone will give me pushback and say, no, yes, we are. And I'm open to being challenged by my fellow transportation scholars. But my argument is that we actually are the receivers of a socio-technical system, right? One that tended to value highly science and scientific planning as something that could be done objectively, somehow in a realm beyond, the dirty politics. So we inherit that. We inherit a tradition that is very technocratic. Yes. So the state of the practice for transportation planning in the world in terms of predicting and so on and so forth, it was created for those highways, right? So the modeling framework that's used today as the state of the practice, it's the result of people inventing those methods because they needed to predict and provide when there was all that investment or all that money going into broad projects from the federal government. So that sort of mentality, I think that we are somehow scientific and we value technical expertise above other things. To some extent, I think, and here I'm speaking for myself, to some extent made me think that, okay, I'm a technical person, I'm not taking sides, I'm not taking positions, it's not political for me, right? So I think that sort of, blindness may be more prevalent than we would like to admit. And just to, drive home that point, this is from the turn of the century, early 1900s. The rector of the Office of Public Roads, which would be, the predecessor to the Federal Highway Administration and so on and so forth, right? So this is federal official. And he believed that scientific experts could best address the broad problems in the nation by applying apolitical judgment, using data that was impossible to refute and that would be free of political, of corrupt influence, right? So that's kind of where we come from as a discipline. The idea that we are above the corruption and the dirt and the crime of politics. We are not really helped because, with few exceptions and not really that stand out, again, transportation scholars as a group, we have not been great students of history. We have not been great students of philosophy. We have not been great students of sociology, to mention three relevant fields of knowledge, right? So it's really not something that we have done collectively. I imagine that individually, some of us would probably have done a little bit of, historical reading and so on and so forth, but that's not really reflected in what we talk about and what we publish, right? So we really haven't been great scholars of any of those things to complement our expertise in transportation, which leaves us a little bit blind, right? Now, there is the argument that science is tainted if it becomes involved in politics, and the reality, I think, it's quite the opposite. That science and justice actually should go hand in hand. They should not be divorced. In fact, they're natural companions, right? That one can be a scientist and at the same time embrace the ideals of justice without compromising their integrity as scientists. As I scan the landscape, what I find is that that idea that science and justice are not divorced is probably something that we're seeing. Well, I mean, this demonstrate that is something that we're seeing more and more and more and more. This is a search on Web of Science of papers, and the key terms are transportation and justice. And there has been a almost explosive growth of the scholarship on transportation and justice in just the past few years, right? This has been driven by some quite remarkable scholars. So this is just some of the key people in that arena. We have Steve Farber over there, who is actually the project director for Mobilizing Justice, right? So he has really been instrumental in getting some traction to those to some of these ideas. Then we have Kevin Manaugh, Megan Winters, Ahmed El Ghanaidy, all Canadian, right? So Farber, Manaugh, Winters, and El Ghanaidy, they're all Canadian, which I find quite remarkable. And then we have Aaron Golub and Karl Martens. Karl Martens is the author of the transportation. Yes. Transportation justice. Transportation justice. So he's one of those scholars who has been banging this drum for probably the longest, and so he's also part of this group. So we have that increasingly. There is that idea that we can actually be in a way political. I mean, to talk about justice, you have to be political. There is no way of avoiding that. That you can do that and still be a a scientist with integrity and who does not need to compromise their scientific ideals or principles. So as transportation scholars, I think, we are sort of, there is this clarion call saying, go walk, right? So just three recent calls for that, Arroyo, Higashide, and Casper, all saying the exact same thing. Saying transportation, you need to pay attention to this. Transportation, justice matters, right? And making the argument for that. It's a difficult argument to make because it's basically a moral argument, right? And yet, there are people who are making that call. I didn't have, you see the comma? I was going to add Sukhov, who is a PhD student here at Mac, and she is the lead author of a recent report. I ran out of space. But yeah, it's one more to those calls to, you know, the discipline of transportation to go walk. Something that I didn't realize until, you know, just this morning as I was collecting my references for the presentation is that if you paid attention, you saw that the authors and the years were there when relevant, okay? So most of it is from the past 5 years maybe, right? So it's really new. There is a wonderful paper in you know, the quality of the scholarship, even if it deals with, you know, such a sad topic. But Ingram, who wrote about white men's roads over black men's houses, right? That's only from 2020. So 5 years ago, it would have been really difficult to make a coherent case that transportation can be and has been a tool of oppression, right? So the scholarship in the past 5 or 7 years has just been remarkable, which is really great to see. So the other thing that is interesting about, you know, most of the resources that I used for, you know, to prepare this presentation is that probably none of them come from transportation. They come from history. They come from the legal scholars. Ingram, wait a second. Ingram is a historian, Archer is a lawyer, some from planning, some from geography, more broadly, but nothing really coming from transportation. So as I reflected about that, my sort of, you know, conclusion was that transportation scholars, I think, are increasingly heeding that call, right? That we need to do more to serve the cause of justice. But that we have been, and this is where, you know, there might be some controversy, but my argument is still that we have been sort of blindsided by our, you know, the culture of our discipline. So one thing that I have really discovered working as part of Mobilizing Justice is that we had to look beyond. We couldn't just stay in our niche, right? So we had to go and following the lead of Anastasia, it was reading these, you know, these things in philosophy, these things in history, these things in, you know, legal scholarship, right? So looking beyond and finding all those common interests, building bridges with scholars from those other, from those other disciplines. And then moving that knowledge to the classroom, where I think it can be very impactful, and also to practice, so that doesn't stay as an academic debate within the transportation discipline, but something that actually can have an impact on transportation practice in the real world. So coming back kind of full circle, food binding was a practice that lasted for centuries, probably about 1,000 years, despite opposition at different points by scholars, by the government, and so on, right? Somehow it persisted. But when it declined, it did so fairly rapidly, as it happens with revolutions. So it happened fairly rapidly, and it was clearly associated. It was seen as a major event in the emancipation of women in China. So something that may have seen and probably looked like this is the way things have been forever, and it changed in the course of a couple of centuries, leading to countless lives free from pain, with the ability to move and to be active, right? That would have been impossible for women with bound feet, 400 years ago. So thinking about that and how it sort of, that socio-cultural practice collapsed around shoes, makes me wonder, what will just transportation look like in the future? We know that it's not what we have at the moment, right? It's something that will have to be different because what we have is not it. And so I think that part of our challenge is to imagine that. If you know the story of the World Fair, was it in Chicago when they had the World of Tomorrow? That was a huge cultural impetus to automobility, right? So imagining it is key to making it possible. You cannot get there if you don't know what, where there is. So that we really need to imagine what those futures will look like, what a future just transportation system will look like. So while I don't have, and I don't know that anyone has like pretty strong answers about, I think that mostly we'll have educated guesses and opinions, but it will be a transportation system that is responsible with our global commons, transportation system that is kind to people and that allows everyone to achieve their full potential. So as a final note, the musical accompaniment at the beginning, it's a recording by Alan Lomas. Some of you may know him, but he was a folklorist and he traveled in the American South and made recordings, many of them in prisons. So he has recordings of people who were on death row, in chain gangs, and so on and so forth. And that song that we heard at the beginning is essentially people chained, hitting rocks. And the verse of the song is, travel makes a good growth. But if you want to go back and listen to that song again with some tranquility, it breaks my heart when I listen to that song and you hear how their voices break with the effort of lifting the hammers and hitting the stone. it's just something that, it's impossible to describe. But that makes me think, with the land acknowledgements, that we acknowledge that we are in a certain land that, is traditionally belongs to certain people and so on and so forth. How many roads and how many of the infrastructure that we enjoy will need an acknowledgement for the efforts and suffering of the people who put it there so that we can now benefit from it? So with that, I come to the end of my talk, and there is the QR code for that report by Anastasia, and the Mobilizing Justice website is great, full of resources now. So please take a look. And thank you again for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have a zillion questions, but audience first. So questions for our amazing guest speaker. That was so interesting. That was really, really fascinating. But questions? Yes.
Here we can see that in the recent 5 years, lots of emerging literature on transportation justice and most of the Canadian scholar. Is there anything happened behind this? I mean, maybe in the recent 5 years, maybe people also worked on this before that did not specifically use this terminology. Or maybe there's an initiative of Canadian government specifically that encouraged the academics on this. Is there anything like that?
So where does it come from? I'm certain that there will have been examinations of issues of equity and justice in the past.
Yeah.
My sense is that a lot of it will have been in the context of cost-benefit analysis, right? So it was like transportation and equity in the context of cost-benefit analysis, which makes it, something a little bit different.
Yeah.
So where does this interest come from at this particular point in time? And so that's a fascinating question, because I think it's like, what are the intellectual roots of an idea? And there is not a single one. I think that there was a work on social exclusion, and that work predates this by decades, right? There was also a lot of the work on the spatial mismatch theory, which basically say that Black people and jobs were mismatched in space, right? So some of it can be traced back to that. And then one of the catalysts, I think, is the social exclusion work in the UK in the late 90s. Okay. So that sort of, brought together a bunch of things. It was sort of a catalyst because it was a big project. It had, at the moment, it had the backing of the government of the United Kingdom. And it went on to inspire a few different things, including work that I did with Steve Farber on social exclusion in Canadian communities, which then becomes a central theme of Steve's career, and sort of, gets to the point where he is leading that Mobilizing Justice project, right? So you see that it comes from a bunch of different places, and in this particular case, it passes through me and Steve, and then Steve takes that and does all these, right? So when I show that tree map with the names and the publications, Steve is the director of project director for Mobilizing Justice. Kevin Mano is associated with it. Megan Winters is a member of the leadership team. Ahmed El Gennady is also allied with the project, right? So what we're seeing here partly is this like a boom that has been pushed by Canadian researchers. partly thanks to the generous funding from SSHRC and every partner who helped with that. But again, that's kind of contextual, right? Because then you have like Aaron Golub and Karel Martens and other people who have done an amazing job, but they haven't had $2 million to work with, right? So it does make a difference. Thank you, Sadia.
Thank you. It's a question from Mark, and then Virginia, and then Melike now has a question from Lauren, yeah. Or Virginia.
Yeah, sir. We really appreciate your discussion of good roads movement, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on regarding how it enabled the some African American population, American South, to move northwards to better employment. Especially concerning this good roads movement enabled the automotive industry to grow to the point where there are enough new cars that they became used cars, so that these excluded communities could actually afford to buy these once upon a time $1,000 cars for a $20 bill.
Yes. That's a great question. So my historical evidence in that respect, there is still a void, and it's something that I'm actively exploring. It's difficult for me to say at the moment. What were the benefits? I mean, not all Black people were in chain gang, right? So they were not convict labor. Some Black people must have also seen a benefit from this. The question is, to what extent, right? And if history is any guide, I mean, I cannot tell you what it was like then, but I can tell you that today, African Americans are still in a really bad situation when it comes to transportation, right? And I suspect that that's probably a constant. So that, yes, there will have been some benefits. Now, there is a question here, and thinking about, concepts of justice and so on, that there is, we can talk about horizontal equity and vertical equity, right? In this case, I think that it's something that most people saw a benefit, right? So everyone is a little bit better off, at least. But that some people are much better off, right? So that the distribution of those benefits was disproportionate. Even if Black people benefited, they did so proportionally or disproportionately less than white people did, right? Something to look into if there is a historical record for that, because essentially like transportation impacts were not a thing until the 60s.
There are a number of monographs were published on this in the late 70s, mid 80s, although they kind of just disappeared under the Reagan era, which is quite unfortunate, which when I was looking at your graph, I was just going, if you look at the 1980s, you'll see this big blip, and then gone.
Yes.
And it's all out California, Chicago, Detroit, and New York is, I noticed that your picture of highway construction was New York, which I was surprised that you didn't mention that they actually built the highways at a specific height, so buses couldn't get out of Harlem.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things they hid in the record.
Thank you for the question and comment. No, that's great. Again, that's part of my argument is that I have this feeling that transportation keeps trying the exact same thing all the time because it has no historical memory. And that'll be part of it, that it's been done, it's a blip, it's forgotten, right? So what can we do to make sure that that stays as living memory as opposed to something?
The problem is you build the infrastructure, just keep maintaining it. You don't see that bus can't get out of Harlem, and when it's time to fix the bridge, you don't raise it 2 feet so the bus can get out.
Yeah.
You just keep patching up the concrete like downtown Toronto.
Yeah, that's what they did with the cabinet. So really interesting because there is also a debate about what happens with aging. Like the interstate is what, 60 years old, and so it's
1953 Eisenhower.
yeah. So it's reaching the end of its natural life, and so some of the current debates are: do we remove it and do something else, or do we patch it as they did in Toronto, or do we, tear it down and build it new? So those decisions will sort of, be will become very important in the next probably 10 or 20 years.
Virginia, and then that was great. Thanks so much for that question. That was good. Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Virginia.
It's as much a reflection as it is a question. As a historian, I see that all the disciplines around us are extracting our methods and our ways of dealing with their own subjects.
And we're happy to share.
And we're happy to share. Because history is philosophy too, but I'm wondering, he raises a very good question about who is funding transportation if it isn't generous SSHRC or somebody. It's got to be the car companies that's putting money behind. So to what extent is merging it with problems, the human rights problems of what's the problem with what you're putting together in terms of being able to move forward and get people to understand the damage the cars actually do to all of us?
Yeah, no, that's thanks for sharing, and I think it's something that probably it's in the mind of pretty much every single transportation scholar, because yes, it's when it comes to money, getting some, a grant like this for a transportation project is extremely rare in Canada.
Yeah.
It's happened twice in the past 30 years, right? So it's extremely rare. But if you don't have that money for something that is mostly public, something for the public good, then you're left with, we have the innovation, what is it called?
LRT.
Innovation.
So there is the McMaster Automotive something with our distinguished Excelsius professor, Ali Ahmad, who money raised on him, right? And what are they doing? They're doing algorithms for electric, whatever that's called. And more recently, AI. AI is going to solve transportation, right? But they get a lot of money. They get a lot of money from industry, right? The money for that is there, despite the fact that I think it's like, a really bad idea to give money to that. And yet the money for something that would be a public good is always more scarce, which is, a perennial problem.
It's kind of
Yes.
weird that, it's kind of weird that's the question when 15 years ago, Elon Musk promised that building those autonomous buses for everyone, and he also promised a $20,000 electric car for everyone. And just 2 years ago, he flipped to the dark side.
He did.
And then it became a fascist.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
went completely over to the darkest of the dark side.
We see how that works. So, so does Nambi have a?
Yes,
a macro-
Namdi.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much for your. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Nambi.
We can't hear you.
Yes, we can't hear you.
Oh.
Can you hear me? Wow.
We can't hear you.
He's talking, we just can't hear.
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Is he gone?
Yes,
I'm
he's
guessing
gone.
he's rebooting.
No, he's here.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yay, owl.
Hello.
So while we're waiting for Nambi,
But I'm not sure
I
you guys can hear
I
me.
have so many questions. I guess kind of a little bit to sort of build on Mark's question and points earlier. I'm really sort of thinking about, and it's kind of, sort of a philosophical question, I guess, justice question. Like, how do we make sense, or how do we weigh these things out? So, so you're talking about human rights violations involved in the construction of the highway system in the United States, and there are now analogous developments in Canada as well in our own history. But then, so we think about that, so the discrimination, et cetera, that resulted from these kind of from these initiatives. But now we look at these roads and these highways, and we think, okay, they're used for public transit, and so they help people get around in a way that is less polluting for the environment. They help cyclists get around another way that is better for the environment. So how do we sort of balance these things, right? On the one hand, the injustices that helped create these transportation networks. On the other hand, that now they can be used for a public good.
So that is, I think, where I and some other transportation scholars have kind of struggled with, again, because of our sort of technocratic formation and limits. And so one early decision with Mobilizing Justice was that we were not going to come and tell people this is what you do. We were going to maybe offer them tools and knowledge to make their own decisions, right? It was not our role to come and tell the city of Toronto, do this is the right thing to do, because what do we know? And besides, they are a democracy, so they can pretty well decide what they want to do, right? So as part of doing that, we took a very careful approach not to come in as the authorities, but rather as knowledgeable people that were learning and were willing to listen to what they had to say, right? So there is what's it called? There's a community of practice group that includes members of communities, people who advocate for transportation, for mobility for people with disabilities, and so on and so forth, right? So part of that exercise of listening without saying this is what you should be doing, right? In the end, I think that it's a matter of an aggregation of preferences, right? That will have different tolerances and preferences for certain things. So if it was up to me, it would be reparative justice across the board, right? That I think that Canada is a sufficiently wealthy country that it could afford to repair those harms. So if it was up to me, it would be that, right? But then there will be 10,000 different views on that. And that the only way to say what is the balance, how much should we, restore or pay back for those harms, considering that there are also these other things that were good, right? That it's ultimately something that is a political question. It's not science, it's not technology, it's not technique. It's what do we as a society value?
Thank you. Yeah, Megan.
I guess this is probably the most obvious response, but I just keep thinking about our continuing effort to try and separate science from politics, which it never has not been doing great. And especially when we're talking about political culture in the wrong sense, and the rhetoric of politicization is very much not a modern notion, but in a way it is a misrepresentation of science. Again, science never existed on its own, but it always existed in order to serve some kind of pursuit that was a humanistic pursuit. And so I think it's that, maybe what we have to do is not try to justify. We say roads are built for people and society. They're not built for just the scientific pursuit of the perfect road. Right? And so I think, I think it's wonderful that your field is going in this direction. I keep thinking of historians in the States who work on white flight, for example. And this is not my area at all, so I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. But I keep thinking of the fact that transportation was used there to create segregation, to perpetuate segregation. So through these white suburbs, but also in Washington, and you go to visit Washington, how the metro is going to go past black neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So they're not to make them, to remove them. Yeah, and you know, that's a majority black population. So you're creating through public transportation. And so I think at the end of the day, it's always been about justice and injustice. And so the question is just now how to, you know, make sure that states are thinking about that balance.
Yeah, so that's great. Let me just comment on that, because actually Amanda is working on something related to that. It's like the white flight is associated with how did we design suburbs and so on. So she'll be doing work on that. Something that really interested me. And I guess science has been maybe a victim of its own success. In the sense that, yes, I don't know how science was seen in the 19th century, but it was like our modern scientific infrastructure was basically invented in the United States to keep politicians at arm's length, right? So they didn't want representatives and senators coming and saying, you shouldn't research this, you should research that. So they basically created all that infrastructure to say, no, we're experts, we do peer review, we are the ones who know what we're doing, don't come and tell me, right? So they apoliticized science because they knew that in the context of the United States, which was spending, huge amounts of money after the war, that it was going to be in the hands of crazy people who will come and say, no, you cannot research frogs, or whatever, right? So in that sense, I think that part of what you're saying is that science has always been political. It cannot not be. It's like as a human activity, it has to be, right? It's impossible to make it
One
otherwise.
of the problems we've made is we've reified science. We allowed scientists to also define it as, I think part of it might be pushing back at being influenced by governance. I can see that. But I think part of it is also that it acquired its own way of saying that they were pursuing a truth that was free from any kind of necessary
Religious affiliation.
religious, I think.
Hegemony of science.
Hegemony of science.
Yeah, and I think that historians are probably much better at maybe acknowledging that than other types of scientists. But yeah, it's something that clearly will be like, the perfect road. It's like, yes, the one that optimizes the transportation problem and gives you, right? So it has a single objective and it's done that's scientific.
Right. Whereas, a place like France, engineers are in government. You go and get a degree in engineering, medicine, or sciences, and any other kind. And I don't even think we should separate sciences and human. By the way, I think it's artificial. It is very artificial.
Yeah.
But I do think that understanding is that those fields of knowledge are useful for thinking about building a more equitable society in many countries. It's just, as you said, the North American context.
It's really good.
As a fellow transport scholar, I find transportation fascinating because it's a topic rather than a discipline, and lots of different disciplines communicate. And I really appreciate that they started off with history, because I think historians have made so many contributions to transportation justice. It's just not called transportation justice. It would be called highways and racism. And we don't use those words. And that's where we've learned for decades about all of these really interesting, justice. So I wonder if you have any comments on how moving forward we can get better at being interdisciplinary. And it's interesting that you frame it in terms of mobilizing justice, which I'm also part of. I think it's great, but mobilizing justice is still very technocratic, and it got the money because it said it was technocratic. And of the money, very little of it goes to the non-technocratic stuff. And it's the technocratic stuff that gets way more papers, and it's easier to have labs and get the oh, look at this huge increase. And you're like, well, that's the stuff that's more digestible. It's less political than the smaller. So I'd love you to push Steve more in this direction. And thank you for doing the history part and bringing that up, because that doesn't seem to be part of.
I know. So I pushed Steve in directions, and then he sort of does toys that bounce back. So he's pretty strong-willed, and he's super smart, and that he has his own ideas. And sometimes he's perceptive, not always. So I'm not sure. I mean, because part of it is the scale at which we do it, right? And Mobilizing Justice is a great example of that. We see this boom in transport justice research because there's all that money coming in, right? So that matters. And so the scale at which we can do that, so you're right, Mobilizing Justice was presented as something that's going to give the tools, the techniques, the technical elements for planners to make decisions, right? It was not, we're going to teach the planners the history of racist highways, right? That said, you probably have seen Lorena and Matt's report. So I think something that, again, is sort of, percolating, right? There is a fascinating report of, it's called Missed Connections, and it was done by a professor in the University of Toronto and a planner in the city of Toronto, and they went and looked at 40 years of archives in the city of Toronto, looking for all the missed opportunities for improving equity in transportation planning in Toronto, right? And they found something that I thought was fascinating because, I mean, talking about the United States, I mean, it's the most egregious case, right? It's like, it's just so appalling. Well, and we could talk about, railroad in Taiwan and, projects in Africa.
It's not a competition, they're all bad.
Well, the thing is that, the United States is, it's just so fascinating because they can live with some of the best and with some of the worst, right? So it's like, yes, it's like, that is appalling, but at least we know about it because there is a scholarship around it. Whereas if you go to any other place, it would be like, it's equally appalling. It knows because nobody has, dedicated resources or time or effort to document and study those things, right? So that's the reason why the United States is, an easy target in that sense. But what they found with that, research looking at the archives in Toronto is that there was still a bias, but it was not of, what do you call it, commission. It was of omission. It was the things that were not done, right? So that people were left behind because how decisions were made to promote something else, right? And that still can be biased. It's not, convict labor, but the outcomes can be still, quite bad. And it's just by not choosing that path. Yeah.
It's like a tunnel underneath the gardener or whatever.
No, but that's an excellent idea.
That's gonna help a lot.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's awesome.
And three, they are back to, so what can we do about it? And so I taught this to a bunch of people, but I really hope that we will see at some point transportation historians. Right, but that's really, I mean, because it's like, the history of slavery, and it intersects with that, right? Whereas there will be a lot of things, just as a historical tidbit. When metered parking downtown Hamilton was proposed, businesses hated it. They didn't want it. They said free parking because they were afraid that they were going to lose customers, right? That was before the inner suburban, outer suburban, exurban, big box malls, and so on and so forth. So if they had argued for metro parking then there, they could have argued for metro parking in those other places later on, except that, by making it free, they just basically let themselves open to be destroyed by the next big box that is going to have 1,000 parking spots instead of 3 in front of the store, right? So as an example of a little bit of history, right? It's like, it's not justice, necessarily justice related, but that why is it that we don't know these things? We keep trying the same thing over and over again, and failing over and over again.
But I mean, that actually is kind of really interesting in terms of what you're saying about that research in the Toronto archives, the things that were done, right? And so it's easier sometimes to look at the things that were done because you can see those archival traces. But how do you find the gaps, the omissions, the absences, right? Because they are, as you're saying, as telling as anything else. Other questions from our audience?
Maybe Namdi.
Can you guys hear me now?
Is Namdi back?
Can you hear me now?
Namdi is here.
I don't see it.
Let's try
Can you hear
Namdi.
me?
Okay.
Okay, Namdi. Okay. Wrote a question. Yes. Can you read it or?
Yes. So everyone can see it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my next question.
Yes.
Besides,
So,
what other?
first question. I don't think that in Mobilizing Justice there's been any sort of transnational work because by design it was supposed to work within Canada for Canadian communities and planning agencies. But that's again something that is for most people so far removed, right? So it's like the mining of rare minerals that are essential for batteries. Yes, that the average person driving an electric car, they probably have never thought about it, right? And yet, it's still hard, right? So I won't be surprised if there will be, some geographers at least that have looked at those geographies of exploitation or something along those lines. But Mobilizing Justice hasn't done anything around that. And then transportation and communication technologies. So that is another one of those things. And again, I think that we have sort of been blindsided by like Elon Musk, right? That says next year there will be self-driving vehicles. Next year. And it doesn't matter because he's not trying to accomplish that objective. What he's trying to do is to foreclose alternatives.
Yeah.
A fascinating piece about that is the Hyperloop that Musk tweeted, high-speed rail, that is so 20th century. The future is Hyperloop. So a really serious initiative to build high-speed rail in California was completely derailed by a tweet. The moment that Musk says, Hyperloop can do that and better. Oh, why should we spend money on this? If Musk promised that this is going to be there, it doesn't matter. He doesn't care. That's not the point. The point is not that at some point there will be, that someday there will be a Hyperloop. There will never be a Hyperloop. The objective was to derail the conversation so that there was no high-speed rail in California because he's in the business of selling cars, right? So that was to say that we are easily, someone says technology and our eyes go like this, like cling, 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 cling. It's like a new app. Ooh, AI. Ooh, right? So for some reason, socially, we are so easy to dupe with technology. So if you say, to someone in a position to make decisions, for example, last year I had a small encounter with a lady who was probably 80. And she was coming out of the Shoppers Drug Mart in Westdale with her friend who was probably 90. And she was helping her friend come to get her, COVID booster shot or whatever. And they were coming out and they were muttering darkly because they couldn't get the shot. they came and they said, oh, no, we don't take walk-ins. You have to make an appointment with the app.
Right.
What is an app? Right? So that, other choices that we're making about the use of technologies also end up excluding people, and that, that would have been an executive at whatever is the parent company of Shoppers Drug Mart, and said, well, we can save money by just asking everyone to have an app. Just like that, 90-year-old ladies can't get their booster shots.
And it's a reminder of the justice concerns that are just embedded in all of this, right? And that some of the technologies or many of the technologies and the initiatives that are developed that are purportedly solving one problem, perhaps are creating a whole other series of injustices. Are there any last questions or comments for our amazing speaker? This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was Joining of the Caribbean, but I am like such a transportation I love this stuff, man. Like urban discussions about urban planning and transportation and bike networks. I am like all in. I just love it. This is great. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. And thank you for this amazing audience here in person.